Hello, boys and girls. Mr. Pinto, how are you? Time for some Book of Excellence. So, I just want you to know that sometimes you think that I have such a glamorous life, get to sit in my office and people bring me donuts, and they do, which is cool. And I did today, thank you. And, walk around, do some fun things, make videos. So, I made this video on the computer with a program called Screencastify. I got it all done. Oh my gosh, I looked great. I mean, again, hard for me to look good. Got it in, watched it. Guess what? No sound. So I tried again with the computer, and I couldn't get the sound to work. So I've done something wrong, all right? That happens. But, did I throw the computer across the room, have a fit? No. I said to myself, all right, call somebody for help. They weren't available. So I'm like, okay, what can we do? So I'm going old school, all right? Old school, not using the fancy computer. I'm using my phone, okay? I'd show you my phone. However, it's attached to the video here, so I can't do that. But I want to show you how glamorous my life is right now. I'm in a conference room, okay? All around is a conference room, okay? And my phone is leaning up against the Lysol bottle. So, just so you know, this is the stuff that goes into these Screencastify, or these moments for your Book of Excellence. So I want to start off before we go into the Book of Excellence with a letter I received today from Mathis Beck. Mathis Beck says, I am a YouTube sensation. So this will go on YouTube because I usually upload it to YouTube so that people can see it and it's easy to share. And he says, I watched your YouTube video, Mr. Pinto. So Mathis Beck, this video, hopefully with sound, is dedicated to you. So we are about to open up the Book of Excellence and look at all these good life skills, all right? So here we go again. Mrs. Hackey in the other room has had a chance to hear me do this twice. So I'm sorry, Mrs. Hackey, you're hearing this again, but we're doing it. So we're going to lead off with Brooks Lowry for initiative for Mrs. Burke, as well as Jasmine Maderi for self-control. Anthony Valdez Cruz for effort, as well as Henry Vaughn and Layla Leone for effort for Mrs. Storms. Lily Vaught gave good effort. And Ember Weedon, way to go, Ember, for effort from Mrs. Tholen. Nova Allen from Mrs. Oakley for kindness, as well as personal best. So she signed twice. Paisley Tyler, who's a new older sister now, has a baby at home. Personal best from Mrs. Cox and Mrs. Morris. Olivia Dutton. Olivia Dutton's working hard. Mrs. Storm says lots of good effort. And Charlie Livingston for effort from Mrs. Oakley. And Heath Hurleman, way to go, Heath. Effort from Mrs. Uckman, as well as personal best from Mrs. DeVault. Heath helped in the chicken coop. Calvin Gerhardt from Mrs. Oakley for effort. I think the page is stuck together. Let me see. Nope. Dean, the reading machine Cooper for Mrs. Storms for effort, as well as Cooper Beck. We've got Porter Martin for personal best of Miss Uckman, and Garrett Sipple, not once, not twice, 3 times. 3 times a lady. Some of you who know that's an old song. Effort, way to go, Mrs. Storms says. Garrett Sipple, Olivia Jackson for effort from Mrs. Storms, as well as my good friend Jace Richards in Mrs. Early's class, but Mrs. Uckman says he's working hard. Avery Farrell, perseverance from Mrs. Early, as well as Oliver Cornell, from personal best. Maxlin Shelley, active listening from Mrs. DeVault. Kai Oakley, once from Mrs. Tilley, once from Mrs. Storms for personal best, and Austin Lady for effort from Mrs. Oakley. Dawson Diskin for effort from Mrs. Oakley, as well as Gwen George. Maisley O'Connor for effort from Mrs. Oakley. Bryce Short for active listening from Mrs. DeVault. He helped clean out the chicken coop too, as well as Evan DeVault. Max DeVault. We're going to work on the handwriting, Max, okay? You're kind of a hybrid between cursive and print. It looks kind of like, I don't know, Sanskrit. So Max DeVault for effort from Mrs. Burke. Way to go, Max. Stassi Strickler, perseverance from Mrs. Early, as well as Eli Hammond for effort and personal best from Mrs. Elam. Baylor Beck for effort, as well as Lincoln Kessler for Mrs. Storms and Mrs. Ferger for personal best. Eli Shelley from Mrs. Ferger's class for personal best, and Navalia Santiago Garcia for efforts. Keith Watkins from effort for Mrs. Storms, and Hayden Rogers for effort. Noah Henninger and Oakley Jackson for effort for Mrs. Storms. I had lunch with Oakley Jackson. Oakley Jackson loves peanut butter and peanut butter. Or peanut butter and apple, sorry. Peanut butter. Emmett Powell, twice from Mrs. Storms. Way to go. And Sophie Cox, I am a reading machine, growing 6 levels. Mrs. Burnett says, way to go. Emma Coleman for personal best from Miss Uckman. Wade Sipple for perseverance. And Maddie Lowry, personal best from Mrs. Ferger. And Maren Gardner for personal best from Mrs. Ferger. Not done yet. Austin Mulaney, personal best from Mrs. Tholen, as well as Jasmine Hill for effort from Mrs. Storms. Gracie Russell for personal best. And Cole Mextroth for personal best from Miss Uckman. Baylor Beck for effort. And Brayson No for personal best from Miss Ekman. Emma Coleman for effort, and Noah Henninger for effort for Mrs. Storms. Brantley Reed, self-control. Brantley, love seeing that for Mrs. Tilley, and Allie Burnett for effort, as well as Kinsley Colbreth. Abby Burnett for personal best of Mrs. Tilley, and Gannon Fisher. Way to go, Gannon. Effort. Mrs. Storms and Tatum Stockdale for responsibility. Andrew Burnett for initiative, and Rylan Keever for initiative from Mrs. Burke. And Josie Holt for personal best of Mrs. Tholen. Brewer Stroud for personal best of Mrs. Tholen. A lot of good sight words going on here. And also one more from Miss Uckman for giving personal best. That's it, boys and girls. What a great showing we have. Keep the life skills going. Moms and dads, this is what a book of excellence looks like. Comes home to you, please make a big deal. I hope your refrigerator is filled with them. We try very hard to give lots of opportunities for kids to do their best, so we're proud of you. So keep up the good work.